evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to Anderson House, the international headquarters of the Society of the Cincinnati and its American Revolution Institute. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Andy Morse, and I'm the executive director of the Society and our institute. As our educational division, the work of the American Revolution Institute is to present all variety of educational programs and outreach. That starts with assisting K-12 teachers and students and extends to supporting advanced study benefiting scholars, authors, history enthusiasts, and lifelong learners worldwide. This is accomplished through our museum and our research library, which is housed in this very beautiful Washington, D.C. landmark building. Our mission is to promote knowledge and appreciation of the world-changing achievements that occurred thanks to the American independence. As a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization, our main objective is to preserve the timeless ideals upon which this nation was founded. Those ideals, liberty, equality, freedom, justice, civic responsibility, natural and civil rights. Those ideals have shaped our nation's history as well as scores of other countries worldwide. Those core ideals continue to change the lives of countless millions and millions of people who've gone from being subjects to becoming citizens. And these ideals are just as important and just as relevant today as they were in 1775. I'm proud to say this program is made possible in part by support from the Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati. It is also made possible thanks to the very generous and warm collaboration with the Queen Sofia Institute in New York City, as well as the Embassy of Spain here in Washington, D.C. The American Revolution served as the incubator and the cradle in which America's earliest international relations were nurtured. The stories that resulted from that, because of our international allies during the Revolution, are fascinating, even if they're all too often overlooked. And many of those international friendships, such as America's very strong ties with Spain, have truly stood the test of time. This building, in many respects, reflects that. Behind me, many of you have already had a chance to visit, and I hope others of you will later, a wonderful exhibition that features the history of diplomacy and diplomatic and political entertaining that has occurred in Anderson House for almost the last 120 years. This building was built with that international spirit in mind, as its original owners, Ambassador Lars Anderson and his wife Isabel, very much appreciated how important and timeless America's ties and allies all across the world are. And we enjoy that reflection tonight as we think about the fact that Spain's alliance with France and America during our war for independence were very important to our eventual victory. Tonight, we're delighted to have a chance to learn more about that. And we're also pleased to have several distinguished guests and representatives and friends of our partners from the Queen Sofia Institute and from the Spanish Embassy. I'll take a moment before I introduce our next person of great interest. I just want to mention, I met Begonia Santos with the Queen Sofia Institute here last year in Washington, which she was unveiling a really terrific children's application on the American Revolution, and it tells a great story as it is. A few weeks later, we had the chance to visit again here at Anderson House, right downstairs in our research library, and that's where the idea for this very event was born. I quickly began to realize that Begonia was a person of great intellect and grace, but as important as anything, her grace was only exceeded by her substance. And it's been a real treat to work with the Queen Sofia Institute, Begonia Santos, and her wonderful team. Without them, we couldn't have made this night possible. And it's been a real joy to be a partner for this. And I hope the first of many, many to come. We are also very honored to have the Ambassador of Spain with us here to the United States, His Excellency Ambassador Cabanas. I had the pleasure of visiting his home just recently with a cultural event that they've part of a series of events that they're sponsoring this month. Is particularly exciting. They are partnering with the Wall School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University to do a number of events all around Washington, of which we just have the great pleasure to be one of them. But I know that Ambassador Cabanas has enjoyed his 4 years here in the United States. Actually, it's the second or third term that he's had in this great country. So he's a friend of America in many, many ways, and one that we hope to retain, we will have forever and ever. I also noticed how much he enjoyed seeing the beautiful painting that was painted by Jose Villaga right here, right in this hallway. I hope if you haven't had a chance, please take a look at The Triumph of the Dogaressa, an amazing painting painted by a tremendous Spanish artist who went on to closing his life for 17 years as the director of the Prado National Museum in Madrid. And this painting was actually bought with this very house in mind Ambassador Anderson and his wife saw that painting, befriended Jose Villaga, and made sure that it got to Washington actually before this house was opened. They had to keep it over at the original Corcoran Gallery of Art for 3 years. And in the course of that, they had to enlarge the size of Anderson House even to accommodate that beautiful painting. So it is one of our great treasures, even though it doesn't tell the story of the American Revolution. It is truly one of our great treasures. Without further ado, let me turn the stage over to His Excellency Ambassador Cabanas. Thank you so much for being with us, sir, tonight. We're very grateful.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words. I think it's such an honor, such a pleasure to be here today in this beautiful house, so full of history, history of the United States, history of this city, and the history of American diplomacy too, as you have mentioned, and with also some paintings that remind us of Spain, as you have pointed out, this beautiful Villegas painting that has some contact with us, although it is situated in Italy, but it has the connection with Sevilla, with the place of birth of this great painter Villegas. And I'm really honored to be here, and I thank you for your invitation for this very timely event. I'm really happy that two prestigious, these great institutions, the Society of the Cincinnati, the oldest patriotic institution in the United States, and the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, a bit younger, but also very patriotic institution, whose aim is to stimulate the knowledge about Spain and about our shared history, have joined forces for this very interesting event. And for that, we have here two extraordinary scholars and Professor Richard Kagan and Professor Larrie Ferreiro. Muchísimas gracias a los dos. Thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. It's such a great deal of knowledge and wisdom that you have between you that I'm sure it's going to be a very, very interesting conference. So I want to thank you very much, really, to the Society of the Cincinnati and to you, Andy, if I may call you Andy, Andy Morse, the executive director of the society, who's doing an extraordinary job, and also to Begonia Santos, who is the executive director of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, for organizing this event. I'm really, really happy. I think it's very timely because not so much is known about Spanish contribution to the American Revolutionary War. Not so much is known in the United States nor in Spain. And everything that we can do to make this common legacy known is much appreciated, especially when we're closing to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. I think this story has to be known. And especially in this time of uncertainty, these times of difficulties in the world, when our values are really threatened, I think the friendship, the partnership, the alliance between two countries like Spain and the United States should be cherished and should be acknowledged. So thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to the organizer for permitting us to share with Professor Kagan and Professor Ferreiro the knowledge about Spanish contribution to the War of Independence. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Cabanas. Thank you so much, Executive Director of the Society of the Cincinnati, Andy Morse, for your very, very kind words. Distinguished members of the Society, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Begonia Santos, and I'm the Executive Director of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute. Thank you so much to all of you for being here tonight. The great Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset once said that whoever wants to teach us a truth should not tell it to us, but should lead us to a position from which we can discover that truth by ourselves. It is thus with this goal in mind that tonight's conference was organized. The fascinating, as it has been mentioned, and mostly unknown story of Spain's contribution to the American War of Independence, who the key historical figures were, will be presented in a most rigorous manner by our two eminent experts tonight, so that this part of US history can be discovered by all, much like Ortega y Gasset suggested. So allow me to quickly introduce the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, founded in 1954, again, not quite as old as the Society of the Cincinnati, but created by a group of American Hispanophiles who sought to stimulate American interest in the art, the culture, the customs, the language, literature, and history of Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. The Queen Sofia Spanish Institute keeps this vision current by striving to share the contributions of the Spanish-speaking world to the history and culture of the United States, and by showcasing the excellence of the Spanish-speaking world in the numerous fields where we excel. So among our most recent efforts were the app that Andy so kindly described. Again, an innovative tool that allows teachers and students to unveil the role of Spain in the War of Independence through a series of puzzles and games and maps and vocabulary questions. And the recently signed agreement with Spain's Royal Academy of History and the Gilder-Lehrman Institute of American History, which resulted in the design, printing, and distribution of a set of posters, again, about the Spanish contribution that you can see outside. These posters have been distributed to over 6,150 schools throughout the United States and international American schools. So all these historical initiatives are integral to the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute's mission, and we're very proud to be here in Anderson House today, building mutual understanding of the shared history between Spain and the United States. I want to finish these brief words by reading the letter of an American. This letter was written to the mother of a friend of mine, a Spanish woman, and the letter is in response to a letter that my friend's mother had written to him. So the letter goes, "Dear Countess," that would be my friend's mother, "thank you so much for sending me the paper on Spanish assistance to the cause of American independence. We applaud your efforts to make Americans better aware of the debt they owe to Hispanic generosity in monetary, material, and military aid in the course of our struggle for nationhood. Spain played a significant role in bringing about the victory that enabled the 13 colonies to be free. We also greatly appreciate the continuing prominent role that Hispanics play in the development of present-day America. You can be proud of the part taken by your ancestors, Don Juan Manuel de Carranza and Vivero and Don Cosme de Carranza, in several of the naval campaigns fought between Spain and Great Britain at that time. Your work and that of your cousins to commemorate their efforts and those of so many others serve a good cause. We hope it will make more and more people knowledgeable about the extent and importance of Spain's assistance to the United Colonies that were to become the United States. Nancy joins me in sending best wishes and our gratitude. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan, the White House, May 31st, 1985. It is now my pleasure to invite Professors Larrie Ferreiro and Richard Kagan to the podium. Thank you.
First things first. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Thank you for coming. We're actually celebrating the 243rd anniversary of the Treaty of Aranjuez. That was actually last week. And let me give you a quick timetable of how we got to the Treaty of Aranjuez and what it meant. Spain and France had for most of the 18th century been allied against Britain as the common adversary. These were known as the Bourbon family compacts. Both kings, Spain and France, were descended from Louis XIV. They called each other brother, uncle, cousin in their correspondence. And the Bourbon family compacts were a series of alliances that had gone sputtering along during the early part of the 18th century. And then the 7 Years' War broke out. We call it the French and Indian War, but from 1754 to 1763, a world war erupted, and Spain and France did not get the good end of the stick. Britain took Florida, it took Canada. So Spain was bereft of one colony, France another. They lost much else beside. And after that point, Britannia ruled the waves. These two crowns, linked both by military and family alliances, wanted revenge. And they began plotting almost as soon as the treaties were ink on the treaties were dry. They decided to create a combined fleet to defeat Britain at sea, which is where it was most powerful. And they wanted to weaken the British Empire by supporting the American Revolution they knew was coming. Before we even knew, they understood that the Americans would rebel against the British, and they would use that rebellion as part of their revenge strategy against Britain. So when war broke out in 1775, Spain and France were quite prepared. Spain first began providing arms, France after that, but this was not going to be enough to defeat Britain. And so France came into an alliance directly with the United States in 1778 in a war against Britain. Spain, although it was allied with France, did not enter the war at that point. There were still treasure fleets, convoys of silver at sea. And while they were at sea, the Spanish could not risk having that many billions of dollars equivalent preyed upon by the British Navy. When those fleets returned, Spain was prepared for war. And that was the birth of the Treaty of Aranjuez, which was signed. I'm not sure if this laser pointer is very powerful, but the palace is there in the center between the Spanish flag on top and the Bourbon French flag on the bottom. That treaty 243 years ago reaffirmed the Bourbon family compacts. It brought Spain into war alongside France against Britain. And the first consideration was to launch lightning attacks against the territory of Britain itself. I'm going to talk about three theaters of the war that encompass the globe. First, war at sea in the person of Luis de Córdoba. Second, war on land in the person of Bernardo de Galvez. And the third was Spanish-American cooperation during the war in the person of Francisco de Miranda, who also helped to lead the way to the independence of South American nations some years later. The war at sea between the French and the Spanish navies on one side and the British Navy on the other side was the most important theater of the entire war, and it's also the least studied of the entire War of American Independence. And emblematic of Spanish naval power was Luis de Córdoba. He was born in Seville, 1706, to a Navy family which had been fighting during the War of the Spanish Succession that ended in 1714 with a Bourbon king on the throne for the first time, replacing the Habsburgs, and that was Felipe V. You might notice that that name had not been used again until the current monarch, Felipe VI. Among the many reforms that Spain began to instate in its affairs, mostly inspired by the French Bourbon crown, was the creation of a single Real Armada, a single Royal Navy. Before that, there were 9 territorial navies dispersed throughout the peninsula. The Royal Navy, it was also a Royal Navy, combined it under one command and really started the ascent to power of the Spanish naval empire. During the 18th century, it was either the second or the third most powerful navy in the world. And Córdoba rose through the ranks of that navy during those years, many wars, including the 7 Years' War, battles and expeditions, becoming vice admiral, teniente general, in 1773. When Spain entered the war in 1779, Córdoba was then aged 73. This portrait is when he was about 80 years old. And that's fairly advanced for that time. But he led the fleet that was combined between the French and the Spanish navies. Almost immediately upon the signature of the Treaty of Aranjuez, that invasion was planned. 150 ships departed the north of Spain. That's more ships than left for the 1588 Armada. Sailed for Britain to invade, but the crews were laid low by an outbreak of dysentery, which turned these warships into floating hospitals. 8,000 people aboard were laid low. Now, even though that invasion failed, it strategically changed the course of the war because Britain had to redeploy its navy away from the United States back to defend the island of Britain, back also to defend its colonies from this combined navy, Spanish and French, in the Caribbean as far away as India. And that left many parts of British North America open, exposed, and vulnerable, including Florida. Now, while the British Navy was redeploying around the globe, by the way, Córdoba had been named Director General of the Navy. And in July, he led a combined fleet into the middle of the Atlantic based on some good intelligence they had that there was going to be a very rich British convoy in the middle of the Atlantic. And they hunted them and they found them. They found them in the middle of the night by listening for cannon. And so Córdoba, and keep in mind, age 74 at the time was considered advanced, but he was very sharp. And what he decided to do was lead his flagship into the middle of the British convoy, lights out, illuminate his stern lamps so that the British convoy thought that it was one of their warships, and he led them out into the waiting guns of the Spanish and French fleet. Now, some of you have seen the movie Master and Commander, and there's a famous scene, may not be easily visible here, where Captain Aubrey plants a decoy for a French frigate by lighting some lamps that resemble the stern lamps of his ship on a raft, and then he escapes. That incident may have been, in fact, inspired by Córdoba's maneuver, because he came back with 55 ships to Cadiz under British ships captured. You can see some of the figures: 3,000 prisoners, 80,000 muskets, 300 cannon, material and uniforms for 40,000 troops. This was the biggest coup of the entire war. And it did not cripple the, it did cripple, but it did not destroy the British economy. But it did mean that Britain no longer controlled the Atlantic. France and Spain, not Britannia, now ruled the waves. And that played a very important role in bringing England to the peace table some years later. Let's turn now to the war on land, and probably the most famous of the people I'm talking about, Bernardo de Galvez. And Galvez was a scion of the powerful Galvez family, including José de Galvez. He was his uncle, minister of the Indies. His father was Matías de Galvez. He was governor of Guatemala. And Bernardo himself had become a soldier early on, actually during the 7 Years' War, fought as a soldier at age 16, then fought as a commander of soldiers at age 24, and became governor of Louisiana at age 31. Now, why was it important for him to be in Louisiana? This is the Gulf of Mexico, and that was the key to Spanish trade during the 16th, 17th, and part of the 18th centuries. Silver from Peru and Mexico were typically shipped up to Mexico, went by the Manila galleon across the Pacific to the Philippines, which was the entrepot for trade with China. Chinese goods, porcelain, silk, tea, etc., were traded there, went back across the Pacific, and then all of those goods plus the silver from Peru and Mexico were transshipped to Spain, and the Gulf of Mexico was the key, was the nexus. This was the strategic hub of the Spanish Empire. And when the British were able to take Florida, that was, well, let me show you this bottom map here are all of the bases and ports of the Spanish Empire arrayed around the Gulf of Mexico. So you can see the Gulf of Mexico is a Spanish lake, but when the British took Florida, it was like a dagger into the heart of the Gulf of Mexico. And that was the reason why one of the most important objectives of Spain was to reclaim the Gulf of Mexico as a Spanish lake. And that's why Bernardo de Galvez took over as the governor of Louisiana, which also meant he was the military commander. When the Treaty of Aranjuez, the notice of the Treaty of Aranjuez arrived in New Orleans, the capital of Spanish Louisiana, in July of 1779, Galvez went into action. He organized 667 soldiers, some of whom were Americans, some of whom belonged to First Nations, and they marched out from New Orleans and made lightning raids to capture British forts in Fort Butte, Baton Rouge, Natchez. A few months later, they marched on and captured Mobile. That meant that the road to Pensacola, which was the capital of West Florida, was now open. But in the latter part of 1780, still the most devastating hurricane season ever known, swept through the area and destroyed the fleets of Spain, France, and Britain. They were laid waste. But Spain had the home field advantage. It had the bases, it had the ports, and most importantly, it had the dockyard of Havana, one of the finest dockyards in the world. And very rapidly, they were able to rebuild their fleet and reform the attack on Pensacola. March 1781, after the Spanish had been able to repair their ships, they launched an invasion of Pensacola from Cuba, and it arrived shortly thereafter. Galvez led his force into the bay on his sloop Galvestown, where he declared that "Yo solo, I alone, will go forth and not allow any damage to happen or any harm to happen to my troops." And of course, Galvez was not alone, no solamente yo. He was surrounded by his Spanish troops, French troops, and together they laid a siege of 2 months on the British fortifications, and in May 1781, they were victorious. And that meant that Britain was now out of Pensacola and out of West Florida. Now, why is this victory in Pensacola important? It's important because of what happened shortly afterwards at Yorktown. Not long after the Spanish victory at Pensacola, a French fleet under the Comte de Grasse arrived in the Caribbean and was going to spend some time in the Caribbean protecting the French colonies, but then during a short period would go north to Yorktown to support Rochambeau and Washington. De Grasse was going to leave some ships to protect the French colonies from the British, but with Britain out of the picture, Spain said, we can protect your colonies, Comte de Grasse. You take all of your ships with you and then come back, and we will together plan an attack on Jamaica. So de Grasse went north. He was able to defeat the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, which had come to either resupply or evacuate Cornwallis at Yorktown. And that battle might not have been won if de Grasse did not have all of his ships, and he might not have had all of his ships if Pensacola had not been won. And that is why Pensacola and Yorktown are so closely linked. But even though the Yorktown victory occurred in October, November of 1781, the war wasn't over yet. There were many events that happened around the world. Mostly on the far side of the ocean, India, the Caribbean, out of sight of the Americans, which is probably why we in the United States don't read about them in our textbooks. And one of the more important events certainly has somehow evaded American historical literature for some time, and that's Francisco de Miranda and the capture of Nassau. Miranda was born in 1750 to a wealthy Venezuelan family, but he was a good Spanish citizen. He joined the Spanish army. He fought in North Africa. He fought at the siege of Pensacola under Galvez. He rose through the ranks. And a year after Pensacola in April 1782, he became the aide-de-camp for the Spanish commander of Cuba, Juan Manuel Cagigal, to lead a joint expedition with the Americans to capture the British colony at Nassau in the Bahamas. That ship on the right is the frigate South Carolina, which led the expedition. Together, they successfully captured it. This was probably the only major occurrence of the Spanish and American forces fighting side by side. The expedition was a success, rather too late to affect the outcome of the war, because a few months later, preliminary peace treaties were already being discussed in Paris. By 1783, Britain brokered a peace with France and Spain and with the United States, primarily because it saw that its overseas empires were under threat. Islands like Jamaica were going to be attacked by France and Spain. India was under threat. Britain wanted to cut its losses, retain its overseas empire, and that's why it came to the peace table, not because of Yorktown. Spain, of the parties, actually was probably the closest to achieving its goal of most of its goals, including getting back Florida, which meant that the Gulf of Mexico was now, again, a Spanish lake. But Francisco de Miranda's story did not end here. Despite the success in 1783 against Nassau, Miranda was threatened with imprisonment because he'd been disobeying orders during that campaign, so he escaped to America. Now, in Miranda's eyes, the American Revolution provided a model for South American independence. He was the connection between the two. While he was in the United States, he met Washington, he met Jefferson, he met other generals, he visited battlefields, he saw what independence looked like, he saw how it could be achieved. And he toured Europe after that, he participated in the French Revolution. His mind was fixed on bringing his country, Venezuela, to independence. And from 1805 to 1808, he worked to get support from the United States and Britain. Didn't succeed. He then was the leader of a short-lived Republic of Venezuela, which also didn't succeed. Eventually, he was exiled afterwards. Miranda is known as the precursor because one of the people who worked and fought alongside him was a young 20-something Simón Bolívar, who, like Miranda, was also the son of a wealthy Venezuelan family. And it was Simón Bolívar, along, of course, with José de San Martín, who fought from 1819 to 1829 for independence of South American nations and eventually won them. I'd like to now pass the baton to my good friend and colleague, Richard Kagan, who's going to talk about the diplomatic side.
You're a hard act to follow. Thank you. Ambassador Cabanas, Director Morse, Director Santos, members of the Society of Cincinnati, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure, it's an honor for me to be here. It's my first visit to Anderson House. And thank you, Larry, for your excellent presentation on Spain's global strategy and its role in the victory of the 13 colonies in the War of Independence, and especially Spanish intervention after the Treaty of Aranjuez. My presentation is going to be a bit broader and highlight some of the other Spaniards, political and politicians and diplomats who were behind the scenes, not necessarily fighting on the front lines. And as Larry has already mentioned, did I do something wrong? Yes, as he's mentioned, the signal Spanish victory in the War of Independence was the capture of Pensacola, illustrated here in an early French engraving of 1784. Now, the hero of this battle, as you already know, is Galvez, who starting in 1780 in his capacity of governor of Louisiana, had provided clandestine support for American forces in the region. And he engineered or helped engineer and make important inroads against British forces in the region, all of which set the stage for the capture of Pensacola, the battle in which he served as commander-in-chief. Now, Galvez directly deserves credit for this that's some of his accomplishments prior to the siege, for that siege. And I'm no expert in military matters, but despite his somewhat exaggerated boasts about the extent to which that he single-handedly masterminded the victory, and those boasts led to the idea, which is emblazoned on his family's coat of arms, that he did this alone. Larry quoted him, "Yo solo." The truth is, as Larry just said, he was far from alone, as I hope the next few minutes will make clear. Now, to begin with, he was not the only Spanish military officer who present at Pensacola. There were a whole raft of them. Jose de Solano, a naval commander. Jose Manuel de Espeleta, later to become governor of Cuba, viceroy in New Granada. Juan Manuel de Gajijal. And here I should also mention another guy. I don't have a portrait of him, a naval commander, Juan Calvo de Irazabal. And others who assisted Galvez at one point or another included Fernando de Lleva, governor of Upper Louisiana, who got out of his sickbed to fend off a British attack on the village of St. Louis in June of 1780. And then too, there was Bernardo Galvez's uncle, Matias, who acting in his capacity as Captain General of Guatemala, led troops who captured several British outposts in what is now Honduras. And these battles essentially served to, as Larry has explained, to stretch British military forces and in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as in the Caribbean, stretching that kingdom's, Britain's ability to fight in North America. And that was that part of that broader Spanish-French plan to weaken their arch enemy, Great Britain. Now, behind all this, there's the decider, the single individual responsible for the implementation of all those policies, Spain's Bourbon monarch, Charles III, former king of Sicily and Naples, a monarch steeped in the ideas of the Enlightenment. And when he inherited the Spanish throne, he was responsible for instituting a series of important administrative and economic reforms designed to strengthen the Spanish imperial economy and better position it to against its arch imperial rival, Great Britain. Yet, let me get this right. Charles was intelligent enough to realize that he could not do it all on his own. And he had to surround himself with a series of competent advisors who shared in his beliefs in the importance of reform and strengthening Spanish resources at home and overseas. And one of those characters, the Count of Aranda, the monarch's ambassador in Paris, also known for his Enlightenment values, a friend of Voltaire, a friend of Dr. Franklin. keen on Spain's intervention in the in the colonies' war of independence. He wanted Spain to end its neutral position, and that position put him at odds with some of the king's other advisors. But he eventually represented Spain at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the conflict. Some of those characters he was at odds with. Hieronymo de Giralde. He urged caution and neutrality. He was the king's minister of state, Genoese by origin, diplomat by training. He wanted to keep Spain out of the war, fearing British retaliation. And for this reason, he said, what we have to do is strengthen Spanish defenses in Havana. And if any of you have ever been to Havana and see the Fortaleza del Morro, you know what he was up to. That was quite an impressive fortune. At the same time, he sanctioned his dispatch of observers to keep tabs on the North American rebels who wanted to know what was going on with the progress of the war. And he was aided in this respect by this guy who looks, as Begonia said before, looks like the Spanish artist Murillo, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, Luis de Gonzaga. He arrived in 1785 in New Orleans. He had previously served in Venezuela, who had opened ports there to American, but not British vessels. And once in New Orleans, he sends agents to Philadelphia, and through the wealthy New Orleans merchant Oliver Pollock funnels aids to the rebels in addition to aiding American forces at Fort Pitt in order to fend off British attack. And it's also worth mentioning that in the letter that he sent to the American second in command, Charles Lee, in November 1777, he addressed Lee as General de los Estados Unidos Americanos, the General of the United American States, possibly the first mention of the 13 colonies as United States, not as a confederation, United States. And that letter was read to George Washington himself, and that's how we know about it. And here I should mention another important minister. No, did I jump him? But where am I? Did I get to him yet? Did I get to Grimaldi? Yes. Here I should have mentioned that Grimaldi was the first Spanish minister to meet personally with a representative of the Continental Congress, Arthur Lee, who was sent from Paris to Madrid to negotiate Spain's position in the war. Before he got there, he teamed up with the Basque merchant Diego de Gardoqui, and they met Lee in the northern Spanish city of Burgos in March 77. Lee wanted a treaty. He wanted active Spanish intervention and support. And with respect to the former, Grimaldi said, no, I'm still a bit hesitant. But he did at least acquiesce to provide clandestine support to the American forces via Gardoqui's a Basque firm who had been trading with North American merchants for over 10 years. Now, I'm getting set. I'm getting ahead of myself. Grimaldi's idea of offering clandestine support for the rebels had also received the green light of the Minister of the Indies, Bernardo de Galvez's uncle, another uncle, Jose de Galvez. And he was the only one of Charles III's circle advisors who had personal experience in the Americas. He had served as kind of the Inspector General of New Spain, what is now Mexico, where in addition to orchestrating various administrative reforms, he was also responsible for the Spanish settlement of Upper California and the establishment of the Franciscan missions there. This Galvez also authorized more clandestine aid by another Spanish official in Mexico, a guy called Teodoro de Qua. He was the commander in what is roughly now northern Mexico or Texas. So he's an important figure in his own right. And all of his aid is under the table. It's not open and up in the air. It's clandestine because Spain officially wants to maintain its position of neutrality vis-a-vis Great Britain. And more of this clandestine aid, authorized by Galvez, Jose that is, was funneled through the Captain General of Cuba. This man, I'm going to lose my point. Felipe de Fondesiela, Marques de la Torre. And he was too, he wanted, like Grimaldi, wanted to keep his eye on what was going on in North America. And he sent a series of agents known as encargados we would call them spies, of what was going on with the battles in the North American continent. Now, so far I've dealt with a brace of ministers, Grimaldi and Galvez, interested in offering support to the rebels. King Charles, however, had other advisors who would urge a more cautious approach, notably Grimaldi's successor, a man by the name of the Count of Florida Blanca, Jose de Moñino, who was fearful of British attack. He was afraid of losing the Spain's annual treasure fleet from the Americas. His magic word, circumspection, circumspection, be careful, be careful. And that's exactly what Charles did until the spring of 1789. Now, caught somewhere in the middle between these factions was this guy, Diego Jose Navarro. I don't have a photo, who succeeded the Marqués de la Torre as Captain General of Cuba in 1777 and remained there for another 3 years. He's a key figure because it grants American vessels access to the port of Havana, and he dispatches various agents to North America, none more important than Juan de Miralles y Trajan, a wealthy Havana merchant who had been doing business with other various merchants in Philadelphia, none more important than Robert Morris, the famous financier of the Revolution. As Charles and Miralles has served as Charles III's unofficial liaison in the colonies. He set up house in Philadelphia, where he entertained in grand style, hosting Washington on several occasions, and even commissioned the Philadelphia artist Charles Wilson Peale to make 4 copies of his famous portrait of Washington at the Battle of Princeton. And there it is. And one of which is now hanging in the Royal Academy of History. No, excuse me, the Royal Academy of San Fernando in Madrid. And Miralles also visited Washington at his headquarters in Morristown, and it was there he died of pulmonic fever. So it was known much through the regret of General Washington, as well as Oliver Ellsworth, who eulogized the grand old Castilian, that is to say, Miralles, in a letter to a friend. But then, of course, that is to say, at the time of Miralles' death, Spain and the rebels were already allies, as the Treaty of Aranjuez had already been signed the previous spring, paving the way for direct Spanish intervention in the conflict on the rebels' behalf, as Larry has explained. But other than Bernardo de Galvez, there's one other important individual to be mentioned, Francisco Saavedra, an agent, a minister sent by Jose de Galvez as a special agent to Havana in 1780 on a mission to oversee Spanish strategy in the Caribbean with respect to the British. He had his eyes on Jamaica. He had his eyes on the return of Florida to Spain. He wanted to protect New Spain and the entire Gulf of Mexico to maintain the Spanish lake there. He was captured for a time en route to Havana. He was captured for a time by the British, only arrived in Havana in January 1781. But his arrival there was crucial because he was able to provide assistance to Galvez and his forces at Pensacola to help funnel the French Admiral de Grasse the funds and supplies he needed to defeat the British forces at Yorktown the following fall. Now, I don't know I have much more time, but I just want to do a little bit. Oops, I keep on hitting the wrong button. About the time of the Treaty of Galvez, we have the first official U.S. agent sent to ambassador to Madrid, John Jay, who goes to Spain, goes to Aranjuez, actually, seeking loans, contract, and a treaty of friendship and commerce with the Spaniards. There's one stumbling block, however, the Mississippi River. Who has access? The Spanish say, we have Louisiana. This is ours. The Americans say, well, we need access to New Orleans and to the Gulf of Mexico. Poor Sarah, John Jay's wife, and John Jay, they kind of vegetated in Aranjuez in Madrid for almost 2 years. They lived off loans provided them by Florida Blanca. He likes some of the flowers. He likes some of the food. But he was constantly complaining about the high cost of living in Spain. He didn't get very far. And he eventually went to Paris. We signed, was a signatory to the Treaty of Paris. He was assisted then, he was helped in, his position was maintained in Madrid by his secretary, William Carmichael. Now, just briefly, Spanish policy after the war, there were differing factions and differing aims. One group wanted to say, let's recover Gibraltar from Alde and Florida Blanca. They said, let's get Florida back. We need it. That's not Navarro wanted. Stymie British forces in the Caribbean, or shore up Spanish Louisiana, defend their Spanish rights to the Mississippi, keep those expanding Americans at bay. They're all competing with one another, and not quite sure. And the sticking points at this point, let's say during the 1780s and 1790s, are the free navigation of the Mississippi and a free port for the Americans below the 31st parallel. That is to say, a place like New Orleans or another port on the Gulf of Mexico. So at this point, Spain begins to send some more official representatives. One is Francisco Rendon, who's the initial front man in these negotiations. He's in Philadelphia in the early 1780s. He helps to negotiate a series of sales of flour and meat to Cuba. He offers access to U.S. vessels in various Spanish ports in the Caribbean. He has a close working relationship with Washington, lodges Washington in his Philadelphia home on South 3rd Street, visits West Point. He monitors American war aims leading up to the Battle of Yorktown. And then in around 1782, he provides really the first serious overview of American finances, what the situation is in terms of debts and credits of this new nation. And he also explores the possibility for commerce and trade between Spain and the United States. He leaves Philadelphia in 1786, later as Spanish consul in New Orleans. But he's succeeded by this guy you've seen before, Gardecky, who becomes the first Spanish plenipotentiary minister. They didn't use the word ambassador yet. We didn't have an ambassador from Spain until after the War of 1898. But there were ministers plenipotentiary. He arrives in Philadelphia, 1785. He has frustrated negotiations over access over the Mississippi, of the location, the border of Florida. And in 1786, he helps to orchestrate the gift of a jackass, and which Washington really wanted, and Begonia cloth from that rare animal in the Andes that George Washington really wanted. And Washington, once he got the jackass, he said, I need a she-ass too, and otherwise I'm not going to have any more asses in Mount Vernon across the river. And then perhaps his most famous gift in 1797 was a gift to Washington of a copy of Don Quixote. And he did this in the hope of getting Washington to intervene on Spain's behalf in the negotiations over the Mississippi. It didn't work. And we're not sure that Washington ever read Don Quixote either. Now, the next stage in this relationship is the Treaty of San Lorenzo, also known as Thomas Pinckney's Treaty, signed in 1795, which is the beginning of a treaty of commerce and peace that's signed at that particular time and really lasts until 1898. It's negotiated between Thomas Pinckney on the left and Manuel Godoy, then the Spanish minister, on the right. But as for the future, this famous quote from the Count of Miranda, his warning in 1783, this federal republic is born a pygmy. It has required the powerful support of two such power states as France and Spain to obtain its independence. The day will come when it will be a giant, even a colossus, formidable in these countries. She will forget the services she has received from the two powers and will think only of her own aggrandizement. In a few years, we shall watch with grief the tyrannical existence of this same colossus. That's the beginnings of another story, which we can get to talk about in the question and answer session, which I think is now beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I consider myself modestly well-educated on the revolution, and much of what you've spoken about tonight, I was totally ignorant of. Thank you so much for enlightening me, and perhaps others too. I'm a little bit curious. Spain's presence, of course, the Battle of Pensacola, indicated the extent to which Spain was present and effective in that region. Yet when I think of New Orleans, I think of the French Quarter and I think of France. And I'm wondering how did New Orleans become French? Or at least, why did it acquire those characteristics?
Here. That's a very well. It was New Orleans became French after in 1783, right? 1763, 63 with that Treaty of Paris. So that's what we say the French Quarter. It's actually a Spanish. The bones of New Orleans are a Spanish designed city. It remains in its French hands until the Treaty of Paris, the next Treaty of Paris, 1783, when it reverts to Spain. Then a few things happen, especially there's a revolution in France. A few years after the revolution in France, there's a guy called Napoleon Bonaparte comes along, and he needs money to fight who? The British and some other people. And Europe, and so he trades, he sells, as you know, the Louisiana to the United States in 1803. At that point, Spain felt that Napoleon had did them a disservice because they didn't, part of the negotiations of them giving I left the step out. After 1796, it reverts to France. And that's when Napoleon gets it. And then it was supposed to especially stay in French hands. Napoleon sells it, but according to the treaty in which they had negotiated between Spain and France, it was a violation of that treaty. And the Spanish then wanted from the Americans, they said, no, we want Louisiana purchased. And the Americans said, no. So basically it goes back and forth for a couple of times until it finally, after 1803, reverts to the Americans and remains in American hands and from then to this day.
Thank you very much. This is very informative. I believe the copy of the Don Quixote from Spain is in the private vaults at Mount Vernon, which is Washington's estate.
It's the Thomas Smollett translation, which is the famous 18th century translation. He really wanted it. He had heard, Washington had heard about Don Quixote from many people in Philadelphia. He said,
yes,
and everyone was reading.
It was very popular.
And he'd been tilting at British and not necessarily windmills, but he wanted to know about who this guy called Don Quixote was. And so the gift was arranged.
Yes.
I don't know. I've never ever seen the actual copy, and I don't know if it has any annotations by Washington himself. I'd like to know that.
So I'm wondering how much of this history, obviously, the United States of America continues to be a strong ally of both France and Spain. But I wonder if you could tell me how much of this history is taught in schools in Spain.
I think
Begonia.
well, we need a representative from Spain to be able to speak to that directly. Anybody want to volunteer?
I'll volunteer. I am a Spanish citizen. I'm an American citizen, and I'm a Spanish teacher here in the US. I'm a high school teacher.
Please come up to the Please
No.
stand up so we can see you.
Oh, stand up.
Yeah, please.
Oh. No, I just want to tell you a story. A couple of years ago, it was pre-COVID, actually, I participated in a State Department Summer Institute for teachers. And I was one of the 2 world languages teachers there. And we were given a tour of the rooms on the 4th floor of the State Department, where they have a huge collection of art and antiquities and really priceless objects, historical objects. As teachers, we were given a set of those objects, and we were given 2 groups of objects, and we had to pick 2 objects, and starting with those objects, develop a lesson for our students. And I had a really hard time because I had to relate the objects to my class and to teach Spanish or to teach something related to Spain. And I didn't know what to do because none of the objects had any relationship with Spain. However, one of the objects was the bisque figurine of Ben Franklin and Louis XVI signing the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce. But I had to dig really deep to find the connection with Spain, which was Spain's participation in the American Revolution. But it was almost like blood, sweat, and tears to find the connection. And my husband here is a witness of the stress that it was for me to develop a lesson using that object that at the beginning I thought it had no relationship with Spain or anything Spanish, right? But it was a big effort. So my students did a lesson, and the lesson was basically observe the object and what are the voices present and what are the voices absent in the history of this object. And the voices absent were the voices of Spain. And then they had to redesign the figure or the little sculpture to include the missing voices. So it was a successful lesson, I would say, but it was hard to create. And that is my question. Why is this not more often taught, or why is it not in the history books?
Thank you so much. If I could just, and that will be brief, because Larry knows more about it than I do. But if you look at the histories of the War of Independence, starting with and the American Revolution, with David Ramsay's 1787, from the first one, John McCullough, and a whole raft of them other in the 18 teens. Forget Galvez. That Pensacola was mentioned by Ramsay. But for the most part, all of those battles and the strategies that Larry outlined are not in those histories. It's France is there, but not Spain. And if you go and leap forward to the great history of the 19th century of the United States was George Bancroft's 10-volume History of the United States. Look at volume 6, which is on the Revolution. Look for Galvez. Look for Pensacola. Not there. Bancroft set the agenda really for school texts for the next 100 years. 100 years, like I said, and maybe a little longer. Because most school texts are knockoffs of somebody else's big history. And in this sense, it was deemed unimportant, partly for political reasons, those battles over the Mississippi I referred to. But in other words, the relationship went south over those battles of the Mississippi. There were also tensions over the sale of Florida, leading up to the sale to the Treaty of 1821. And then there were battles over the slave trade. Think of the film Amistad. There were other problems. And then, of course, let's go forward to Cuba in the late 19th century and the American War of 1898. For many people, there was no reason, for many historians, there was no reason to insert Spain back into the American historical record. In the history of the 20th century, from a historiographical point of view, is the slow and gradual insertion of that history for the rediscovery of that history that basically Larry has outlined.
And actually, if you can, this is a very good introduction. Can you pass me the clicker?
Sure.
So the question of what does Spain know, Spanish school children know about America? Thank you for answering. What does America know about Spain, and when did the Spanish story become lost? Is the subject of this graphic. And it's a Google Ngram, which I've used two terms, Lafayette and Galvez, as proxies for English language literature mentions that would relate more or less to how much we knew. And the most interesting thing, and for some of you in the back, if you have trouble seeing, please feel free to crane your necks. The battles of Pensacola and Yorktown, which occurred almost simultaneously, saw an uptick in the mentions of Lafayette over Galvez. Galvez is in blue, Lafayette is in red. But then shortly afterwards, the lines converge, and then except for the French Revolution, in which Lafayette played a fairly significant role, for quite a long time, the two names bump along side by side at the bottom, not very well recognized, not badly recognized, but about equal importance. A couple of things happen. Number one, here's the Treaty of Aranjuez, which gave Florida from Spain to the United States. That was the final diplomatic kerfluffles that were happening at this time. Lafayette made his grand tour of the United States 50 years after the American Revolution began in 1824, and his name recognition shot up, and then he died. And that really improved his name recognition. You know, as was often said of Elvis Presley, great career move. So Lafayette's name then takes pride of place, and you can see it throughout the rest of the 19th century. Galvez is bumping along the bottom. This is what Richard mentioned, Bancroft's History. Actually, the volume that talks to the American Revolution, the history takes you from the time of Leif Erikson all the way to modern era. The frontispiece of the American Revolution is not George Washington, it's Lafayette. Galvez is bumping along here at the bottom, the War of 1898. It doesn't seem to have much effect. So you can see when the traces of Spain became lost in comparison to France. The question is, when did that trend start reversing? And if we look in the 20th century, and again, this is now using the same tool by Google, but Bernardo de Galvez, here in blue, you can see that the first major English language biography of Galvez, 1934, had some effect. A lot of interest in Galvez's military career during the Second World War bumps along, the bicentenary comes along. It was when Galvez's portrait was finally instated in Spain, in the Senate, courtesy of somebody who's in this room. I'll let you find out who. And also the granting of honorary citizenship. This is shortly after Tomas Chavez's fantastic, wonderful intrinsic gift, first by Richard's book, then my book, and then by Tom's book. The recognition of Bernardo de Galvez has been climbing, and we hope with events like this that it will continue to climb off the chart and into the stratosphere.
And I should hear, with reference to schools, if you, some of you came in, you may have seen the posters that are out there for use in primary schools. They're the result of a collaboration between the Gilder Lehrman Institute, which has a national presence, and the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute in New York. And that's the beginning of creating the kind of the didactic toolkit that we hope that all of us, I hope in this room hope, that school children will not unlearn about Lafayette, but also add to their knowledge by learning something about Galvez and some of the other issues we've discussed this evening. So in a sense, we're just adding to the pie. We're not, it's going to expand rather than diminish. No one loses. It's win-win all around.
Professors, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation tonight. We are really delighted to have you with us. In offering a couple of closing comments, I will tell you I was particularly inspired by your discussion about Admiral Cordova. If for no other reason that I'm glad to see that a man at age 74 didn't let his youth and inexperience get in the way of serving his nation. So thank you for sharing that with us. I would be remiss if I didn't, in light of the wonderful military, both American and international military histories you've heard about, I would be remiss in also not recognizing a very important member of the Embassy of Spain's leadership contingency. We're very delighted tonight to have back with us a friend of the society, Major General Pedro Garcia and his wife Susan. Major General Garcia is the Spanish Defense Attaché to the United States of America. And General, where are you, sir? There you go. Right. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And the society has generals in its titles too. And that was notwithstanding the fact that that general, General Washington, and that general, General Knox, not only were integrally involved in the founding of the success of the American Revolution, but also with the founding of the Society of Cincinnati. George Washington, of course, being our very first President General. Fast forward to 39 President Generals later, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very delighted to let you welcome our 40th President General, Frank Turner from Baltimore, Maryland, right here, and his wife, Frances. There are too numerous members of the leadership to otherwise mention, except that I will also want you to introduce Mark Williams, who is the chairman of the Board of Governors of the American Revolution Institute, and his wife, Mary Ellen, right here. Frank and Mark would be the first to tell you that one of the hallmarks of the Society of Cincinnati is a spirit of cordial affection. So we will end the night in that very spirit. We'd like to invite all of you to join us and stay for a few moments for a reception afterwards and enjoy some of the conviviality that our guests from the Spanish nation of Spain, as well as the Society of Cincinnati, has to offer here tonight. Back in the original library here are a few very interesting objects and artifacts that some of you might enjoy visiting with for a moment. And the evening is so beautiful. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for the weather as well. And we're able to open the garden up to be able to serve refreshments out there. So please join us. Thank you again, professors, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to have you with us here at Anderson House.